Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the fifth in our live lecture series in the Finance for Non-Finance Professionals course. Today, we're going to be talking about building your business case, which is really a culmination of everything that we've learned in the course thus far. Now, unfortunately, there was a bit of a technical glitch in recording the live session of this webinar. So apologies, because for those of you that were in attendance, we're going to miss out on some of the great questions that you asked. So what are we going to be looking at today? Well, really, we're going to be looking at the contents of the business case, how we might fund a new business, or how we might fund a new venture within an existing business, how we might price this new product or service, and then what sort of financial plans we need to put together in order to support our business case and to justify to our potential investors or those in our corporate environment who are going to sign off on the funding for the new endeavor. What do we need to put to them so that they understand how our project or venture is going to earn money and how it's going to pay back some of that initial capital that is required? So that's really the focus of today. When we think about a business case, it's important to recognize that this is essentially a sales document. You are selling your idea in order to get funding, and you're selling your idea to demonstrate how the investor in this business is going to make a profit and perhaps recoup their investment and earn returns on that investment. Now, potential business funders really want to understand why it is that your product or your service that you're trying to launch is unique. The world is filled with products, filled with services. So, what is it that you are offering that is going to be new, different, better? What are the key differentiators of your product? From an investor point of view, they're also going to want to understand the size of the potential market. In other words, are there lots of potential customers, or is this just a really small niche business? It's not that one is good or bad versus the other, but different businesses and the access to different markets will attract a different investor type. A potential investor is also going to want to get a feel for the financial forecasts. And this really will demonstrate to them those key levers or drivers of your revenue, drivers of your costs, and then drivers of ultimately your profit. And that's what's important to them because that's what's generating the returns on their investment. And then really key to the whole document and the presentation of your business case is the presentation of your team. So an investor wants to understand why it is that you, as an individual, or your team and your founding partners, why is this team going to be able to pull together to get a new venture off the ground? Because any startup or any new product or project invariably faces challenges. And it's going to be the team members that are going to have to hang tough when the going gets tough. So demonstrating that sort of magic between you is really important. So how do we lay out a business case document? Well, the first part of it is really to specify your aims and objectives. Now, these are going to be both short-term and long-term aims and objectives. So in the short term, maybe you just want to start getting some revenue through the door and attract a beta customer group. Longer term, you may have aspirations of expanding beyond your domestic market or conquering a huge customer base. So this would sort of set out your intended strategy, both short-term and long-term, so your investors can understand what it is you're aiming to achieve. The second part of our plan is really about our marketing. And within this, we're going to cover the market size. So in other words, how many potential customers might I be servicing or selling to? What would be the average spend for my product or service that those customers would contribute? That gives me an idea of my revenue and ultimately the market size in which I can hope to compete. So part of understanding how much our customers are going to spend in our business means understanding that customer profile. Who are our customers that we're intending to speak to? What sort of things are important to them? What sort of disposable income do they have? We also need to understand the competitors that are perhaps currently playing in this space. And very few businesses will have no competitors. They may have no absolutely direct competitors at this point in time, but there may be indirect competitors. So in other words, they're doing something similar, or it's a business that could quite easily step into the space in which you're hoping to operate. So understanding that competitive landscape is important. As part of our customer profiling and part of our analysis of competitors, we've got to come up with some sort of pricing strategy. And we will speak a little bit more about pricing later on in the slide set. We've also got to understand our advertising channels. Now, again, dependent on who your customer profile is, this may well dictate which advertising channels you're going to use. If you're speaking to a young consumer base, then more than likely a lot of your advertising is going to be via digital channels. Perhaps, though, if you're speaking to an older consumer base, maybe you will still make use of more traditional advertising in magazines and newspapers. So it's really all of these things have got to fit together and speak to who it is you're trying to sell to and what it is you're trying to sell to them. Section 3 is about our production plan. Now, this sort of lends itself to the production of a particular product, but this could also be, in a sort of a more modern type business environment, the production of some sort of web-based or app-based business. So how will that development be undertaken? Who will those development team members be? Where will that production take place? Are you going to all sit together in a shared office space, or are you going to outsource your development to a team somewhere else in the world? So understanding how you're going to create your product or your service is important. Section 4 deals with the resources that we may require in order to get our venture underway. Now, it's important to note that these resources are going to be both financial resources and what is called human capital. Now, if you need to develop a big web-based platform, clearly you're going to have the skilled development team in order to conduct that work. And that is really the human capital. So who are the people that are critical to getting this product or service off the ground? Part 5 is the financials, and not dissimilar to the key financial statements that we produced as part of the financial accounting section that we looked at in Module 1. We're going to have some sort of income and expenditure statement, some sort of cash flow, and some sort of balance sheet. And this is really sort of adding the granular detail to the grand plan. So it's all good and well saying, I've got this great idea for this new market, new product. How is this all going to pay for itself? How is the money going to flow? And that's what an investor base is going to want to see, the sort of the granular financial details of your intended venture or product. And then what's really important is that we follow this, what we've got here as a SMART acronym. And at each point in your business case or in your plan, just check that you are following these SMART principles. In other words, is what you're saying specific? Too many marketing plans, for example, will say, oh, well, we're going to undertake a digital marketing strategy. Well, how? To who? How are you going to make that happen? Don't just give me generic details. Is it measurable? How am I going to know whether I am successful or not? Agreed, and this is important, and this is sort of a conversation that you might have with both your team members internally and with your investor base. Are we following the plan that we put forward in an agreed manner? Now, quite often when we start a venture, we have a concept of how it's going to turn out, and sometimes the reality ends up being a little bit different. And certainly within a kind of a tech environment, the term pivot has become sort of quite key. In other words, you start down one track, you discover that's not quite the market that you want to play in, or the product's not quite what your intended customer base wants, and so you pivot. So in other words, you tilt the strategy slightly or tilt the product slightly. But it would be important that internally you are in agreement with that, and externally, in other words, when you talk to your investors or your stakeholders, they are also in agreement. I think absolutely critical for a business case or putting together a business plan is that the information you present must be realistic. So in other words, if your market size is in a small geographic area, people that like a particular thing, well, then that is realistically who you're going to be talking to. Don't claim that your market size is enormous. So check your assumptions and make sure they are actually grounded in reality. The T in our SMART acronym is about being time controlled. And this also speaks directly to our resource requirements, our production plan, and ultimately our financial plan. How long is it going to take before we start making revenue? How long is it going to take before we turn cash flow positive? Is there some intended time horizon where investors may hope to recoup some of their initial investment? So when we talk about identifying our resources, it is important, and we've spoken about our financial resources and we've also spoken about our human capital resources, but speaking now specifically about the funding and the finance that we require. Invariably, despite our best efforts, sometimes things go wrong. Maybe we needed some sort of license in order to operate, and for various sort of government bureaucratic reasons, that's taking a lot longer to come through. It means that we can't start operating until we have that in place, and we thought it was going to take 3 months, and now it turns out it's taking 6. So have we got sufficient funding in place to deal with what are called contingencies? So we thought that the piece of equipment that we were going to purchase was going to cost us £10,000, but it was imported and the exchange rates moved, and now it actually costs us £14,000. Have we got sufficient fat in our budget to deal with the unexpected, the things that don't quite go our way? So that's what we talk about, building in sufficient contingency. And then it's really important to separate the funding that we require for capital expenditure to the funding we require for operating, or sometimes called revenue expenditure. We shorten these to CapEx and OpEx. Now, CapEx is really about the acquisition of fixed assets. When we think back to what a balance sheet looks like, we know that that balance sheet has got a fixed assets section, and those assets appear on the balance sheet. So this would be funding to buy equipment, machinery, a factory. It could also be funding to internally develop a software platform. If we're dealing with equipment and machinery and premises, there may be a potential to actually lease those assets rather than requiring the full capital amount to purchase them outright initially. And that may help improve our cash flow situation quite dramatically. It's also important to communicate to investors that that funding is being used for the acquisition of assets, and that the return on those capital assets may take some time to come through and come to fruition. When we're dealing with requiring funding for OpEx, this is to pay for our general day-to-day expenses, so our selling and expenses and distributing expenses, perhaps our marketing and advertising and office administration, rent and salaries. It could be finance charges, or interest on capital that we have borrowed has come in as debt. This is a different source of funding that is required, and it's quite often useful to separate out for investor purposes. We need X amount of money, Y of it is going to capital expenditure, and Z of it is going to operating expenditure, just so that the investor is very clear on what that financing is being used for. So we need to have some sort of capital. Most businesses require a capital injection of sorts in order to commence. Now, if this is a new project or a new division inside an existing business, the business itself may have sufficient accumulated profits, which sit on our balance sheet as retained earnings, from which they can fund this new venture. They may decide to sell some of the existing assets on their balance sheet in order to generate sufficient funding for this new venture, and the human capital may already be in place. So in other words, if it's a new engineering project, perhaps that company already has engineers that are more than capable and willing to take on this new venture. What it does do is tie up company resources, which is why in module 4, when we looked at appraisal methods, it was important to be able to differentiate the benefits of one project versus another in order to ensure that we were picking the most suitable project for our company. Because once we've committed to a project, then our resources, both human and financing, are then committed to that project. Dependent on the nature of the business, we may be able to seek funding from a government or charitable organization. Now, it is very sort of aims and objectives specific. In other words, the aims and objectives of our business must match the aims and objectives of that government funding pool or that charitable organization. The application process, I think the world over, tends to be a lengthy one because the government and charity want to be very sure that when they allocate money, it's going to a business that supports their intended purpose and mission. But so dependent on the nature of your business, that could be a good potential avenue for funding. Then we talk about an overdraft, and this is usually sort of quick and easy for an established customer. And that may be you as an individual, have an established relationship with your bank, and you can personally supply that overdraft to fund your new venture. Or for an existing business that has a banking track record, the bank may be willing also to fund an overdraft facility for a company. Overdraft facilities tend to be expensive, so we wouldn't typically use this for long-term funding, but it may be a really handy mechanism for covering short-term cash flow requirements. We spoke a little bit earlier about the potential for leasing, and this is typically when we need to undertake large CapEx expenditure, and that CapEx is in the form of either a building or a piece of machinery or equipment. And instead of buying that outright, we can choose to lease that equipment. And oftentimes, depending on who we are leasing the equipment from, that lease is what is called fully repairing and maintaining. So in other words, the equipment supplier does the maintenance and repairs on the machine that we've leased. It gives us a lot of certainty on what our cash outflows are going to be, and of course reduces that large capital sum that we may have needed to buy that piece of equipment outright at inception of our business. And quite often, dependent on the nature of the lease, there's actually the option to buy the equipment or machine at the end of the lease period. Then really importantly, so we've got now a business idea. We know what service we want to offer. We know what product we want to make. How do we decide on what price our service or our product should be offered to the market at? And really, and this is starting to sort of blur into the marketing decision making, and of course a lot of research and studies on the consumer base that we're selling into and what their likes and dislikes are, what their income level is, how much they're willing to spend on a particular product or service. But it really all boils down to, what is that product or service worth to the customer? So in other words, what is unique about it that is going to make our potential customers want to part with money? Now, that worth to the customer may be more intangible factors. So in other words, the brand that the product is associated with. Customers are often more than willing to pay a premium for what they consider to be a desirable or an exclusive brand, even if the underlying product is exactly the same. They may be willing to pay a premium for the convenience. So in other words, I know that I pay more for my groceries if I shop at the local sort of store very close to my home rather than going to a big department store. But I'm willing to pay more because it is so convenient and I can just quickly pick these things up on my way home. Customers may also be willing to pay more if the product is the latest version. So in other words, they want to have the kind of the newest, flashiest, whatever it is, and they're prepared to pay a premium for that. What is really important, and in fact, not beyond really important, absolutely critical, is that we need to make sure that we are covering our costs. And we may not be able to cover our fixed costs at inception. In other words, we may not be at that break-even point that we remember from sort of module 2 and 3, when we looked at how many units of a product we needed to sell at a particular selling price in order to cover our fixed costs, which meant we were at break-even. Now, when a business starts out, they may not be at break-even. They may not be generating sufficient revenue to cover fixed costs, which is why it's important to undertake that exercise of separating our costs into variable costs and fixed costs, making sure that our selling price is a markup on our variable costs. So in other words, there is a contribution margin, which is the difference between our selling price and our variable cost per unit, so that we cover those variable costs, and then figure out exactly how many units we need to sell in order to cover our fixed costs, to ensure that at some point in time, and it may not be initially, at some point in time, our business starts generating profit. The right price for our product and service is sometimes this balancing act between enticing our customers to join us and to buy our product and gaining market share. Quite often, and it's slightly unusual and perhaps not always strictly rational, if the price of our product is too low, the customer may undervalue that product or service. So we've got to price it appropriately for our customer segment and for the brand that we're hoping to put out there. So if you're intending to establish a premium brand, you can't go and have cheap products. There's got to be this sort of embedded brand value in your pricing. Now, quite often, and we see it in the airline industry in particular, airlines will really cut the cost to the customer. So in other words, advertise really cheap flights in order to gain market share. So they sell those seats on the plane at a loss, but it's just about gaining market share over their competitors. It's not actually sustainable. We can't go out there and be so cheap as to not be profitable. And initially, it's going to look great and we're going to gain traction and market share. But ultimately, we need to be in a position where that selling price is covering our costs and we are generating profit. We can always try and incentivize our customers to be loyal, to repeat their orders, and then we could look at some sort of discount strategy that we could offer. We need to be careful, though, that these discounts that we are offering are assessed against our intended profit margin. So, in other words, again, that discount pricing must be sustainable over the long term. So, it's no good offering a discount to a customer that ultimately you can't maintain because it is just eroding your profits to the extent that you can't stay in business. So, having decided on what our product and service is, having decided on who we're marketing to, what we're going to price at, we are now in a position to put together an income and expenditure forecast. And this is not dissimilar to some of the budgeting work that we studied earlier in the course. So, this is a forward looking estimate based on our assumptions of how many products we're going to sell, how many new customers we're going to bring on, at what price we're going to sell to our customers. And this is what generates our expected revenue or our sales figure. And keying off that intended sales figure or sales volume, we can start to figure out what our cost of sales are. So the direct costs that go into the making of the product. That allows us to see what our intended or our expected gross profit is. From that, we can deduct our indirect overheads, also known as operating expenses, in order to have a look at what we expect our net profit to be. Now, it is important to note these are expectations. This is not real. This is forward looking. This is what we would like to achieve. So, underpinning this forward looking statement is a set of assumptions on how many products we're going to sell in any particular month, how many customers we're going to gain, how many new customers we're going to gain. We have to build up a set of assumptions. And what's really important is to make sure that these assumptions are realistic. This is what the investor is going to judge you on. No investor expects you to be bang on the money in every month for your forward-looking income and expenditure forecast. They know that there's going to be some variance there. What they want to see is that you've thought about it, that you've tested these assumptions. Have you gone through an exercise where you've said, what if we end up with far less customers than we expect? We sell far less units. What does that do to our net profit? What if we end up in a situation where our customers just absolutely love us and they flock to our new product or service? Do we actually have the infrastructure or the production capacity to cope with that? What would that look like? Would we need to scale up our underlying production process? How does that look? So do a bit of scenario planning and sort of assumption bust your underlying assumptions. So this is a model monthly income and expenditure statement. And what you can see is that this runs on a monthly basis. So we've got January to December. And important to note that this budget actually forecasts no revenue for the first 8 months. And that's not uncommon. If we're starting something new, it may take us some time to build the web-based platform, to build the production capacity, to design our product. So initially, there may be no revenue. The revenue in this model starts to kick in the last 4 months of the year. But associated with this business are initial costs. So we've got a range of costs that we're incurring even though we're not selling anything. So we've planned out those costs. We've planned out what expenditure we need to incur during those early months of our venture. We may have some operating costs that we have to incur even though we're not selling anything yet. So we may need an office. That office is going to have water and electricity. We may need some insurance. We may need tea and coffee in the office canteen. All of this together are sales, which initially is zero, less, or we subtract our production costs to end up at a gross margin, in this case, initially a loss. We subtract our operating costs, and ultimately we can see that in these early months, we are loss making. Now, that is not an unusual picture for a startup business to be initially loss making. And that's not really going to put a savvy investor off. What they're going to want to see is the point at which you stop becoming loss making. When does this revenue start to kick in? And we can see that based on our budget, in October, we actually make our first small profit. They're going to want to see how we grow our sales once they start coming through. They're going to want to see how we grow this profit once we start making it. They're going to also want to see how our expenses scale up with increased production. So in other words, can we hold our gross profit or our gross profit margin steady as we move forward in time? So dependent on the nature of the business, you may put 2 years worth of monthly income and expenditure together. You may be a very kind of long-term capital intensive project, and maybe you would put 5 years worth together. Maybe you'd even put 10 years worth together for a big exercise. And then what we would do is have essentially an annual summary, which is really just the sum of everything that's happened in those prior months, to allow investors and ourselves to judge on an annual basis where we are from an income and expenditure perspective. Having put together an income and expenditure budget, what we can then do is put together a cash flow forecast. So the income and expenditure budget feeds into that operating cash flow statement. It is important to adjust for non-cash items like depreciation. And again, dependent on the nature of your business, you may have payments to suppliers and receipts from customers where the cash does not arrive in the exact month in which you've sold to your customer. So in other words, we've got debtors or accounts receivable, and we may not have to pay our suppliers in the exact month in which our goods from suppliers arrive. So in other words, we've got accounts payable or creditors. So from a cash flow perspective, it's important to figure out when those cash flows are actually occurring. The cash flow statement will also incorporate an investment cash flow section. This is where we are typically spending money on capital items. So this is our CapEx section, if you like. These are for the purchase of assets. And it will also have a financing cash flow section. And this is where the capital tends to come in. And that capital, dependent on how our business is being financed, may come in as equity or it may come in as debt, as an inflow. Let's have a look at an example cash flow. So this particular cash flow doesn't clearly separate out the operating cash flow from the investing and the financing cash flow. It's sort of all bundled together, but that's okay. What we can see here is our capital expenditure line item. So we've got a big outflow amount in February. We obviously bought some particular asset. And then we've got various operating cash outflows, and these are all cash outflows that are occurring here. We're paying our staff, we are spending on utilities, and we would sum together this cash outflow to get a cumulative cash outflow for that particular month. In this instance, we made no sales, so we had no cash inflows. So we've got a net cash outflow of 6,600 for the month of February. And on a cumulative basis, we say, well, what was our cash flow in the first month? In this case, it was a negative 3,200 plus another cash outflow of 6,600 to give us a cumulative cash outflow of 9,800. Now, again, what an investor is going to be looking for is initially, absolutely, we're going to be essentially burning through our cash, outflows, outflows, outflows. But can you see here in July, we forecast our first cash inflow. So now on a cumulative basis, our sort of cumulative negative is no longer increasing. So in other words, getting more negative. Now we're starting to creep back towards positive territory. And finally, here we go in November, we actually have a cumulative positive cash flow. And these are the type of almost break points an investor is going to be looking for. When do we turn cash flow positive? When am I starting to generate cash for the business as opposed to just eat through that initial financing amount? Having put together an income and expenditure statement and having put together a cash flow statement, we can then put together a balance sheet forecast. And this would then show us those capital items that we've purchased that show up as assets on our balance sheet. It would show us the equity or debt financing that we've taken in the equity and liability section on the balance sheet. And what would be important is to also recall that if we have debtors or creditors, or in other words, accounts receivable or accounts payable, these are current assets and current liabilities, respectively, that would need to show up on our balance sheet. And so we would undertake the same exercise to give our potential investors or stakeholders or partners a feel for what the balance sheet of the company might look like going forward in time. And at that point, we arrive at sort of a final thoughts and recap for this Finance for Non-Finance Professionals course. When we think back on the material that we've covered, what we can see is that we really had two branches to finance. We had a financial accounting branch that was about the production of standardized annual financial statements. In other words, our income statement, our cash flow statement, our balance sheet, and also the sort of less commonly spoken about one, a statement of changes of equity, which if we're a big public listed company becomes very important. But this is reporting on what has been in a standardized manner so that in particular external parties, be they bank loan grantors or analysts, because we're a public company, or potential partners, can assess the financial health of our business. Then we have a branch that deals with management accounting. And management accounting is much less structured, so it doesn't have to be produced in a standardized way. And it contains very business-specific information about our costs, our productions, our sales. And typically, we wouldn't share our management accounts with external parties. This is what we use internally to ensure that we are on track on a more short-term basis. Budgeting sort of flows on from management accounting. If we are a going concern, so in other words, a business already in operation, our budget is going to be forward-looking, what we expect to have happen in the future. We may not be a going concern, we may not be in operation, in which case our budget, which we've just been discussing today, is the forward-looking perspective on our new venture. It's based on assumptions and our best guess of how we see our financial future. And I think as a final sort of recap for the course, is that when we deal with finance, there is a tremendous amount of jargon. And often if you don't know the language, it prevents you from getting involved in the financial side of a business or a venture, when actually it's not that the concepts are difficult, it's just that the language that's being used can be challenging if we're not familiar with it. So don't be afraid of the jargon. Ask questions and really get stuck in and participate. I want to really thank everybody that has gone through this journey with us in the Finance for Non-Finance Professionals course. And I really do look forward to speaking about finance with you in the future. And I hope this has inspired you to think about the financial operations in your own business as you sit currently, or perhaps even consider leaping into the unknown and kicking off something new and exciting. Good luck with your journey.